The hum of machines filled the sterile air of Lab Theta, a sound that once comforted Dr. Elara Voss with its steady reliability. The station was carved deep into Ganymede's frozen shell, an outpost of humanity's reach into the far corners of the solar system. But tonight, the familiar noise was nothing more than a backdrop to the strange silence that seemed to grow thicker with each passing moment. Elara's fingers paused mid-typing, and she glanced around the lab. Sparse conversations had turned into tense murmurs among her team, eyes darting and fingers tapping nervously. The fluorescence above cast a cold, unwavering light over rows of equipment, making everything appear more clinical and detached than ever before. Yet it couldn't mask the crackling tension in the air. The first sign had come days earlier when Tom Sanders, one of the junior researchers, was found at the end of his shift, huddled in a corner of the observation room. His mouth was stretched in a grin so wide that it looked painful, and his eyes were red from tears that glistened like oil under the harsh light. "Elara," whispered Dr. Miles Ito, her second in command, interrupting her reverie. He nodded toward Tom, who sat slumped at his workstation, shoulders trembling as if suppressing laughter. His eyes met hers, hollow and unfocused, before he let out a stifled chuckle that sent chills down her spine. "It's happening again," Miles said, his voice strained, every syllable careful and clipped. "I know," she replied, her tone barely above a whisper. They had dismissed the initial signs as stress, the consequence of endless hours spent analyzing alien microbial samples retrieved from below Ganymede's ice crust. The samples, collected from hundreds of meters down, held traces of life unlike anything catalogued on Earth, tiny, resilient, and unnervingly active. But when the episodes began spreading, when Sanders' silent hysteria spread through the lab like an unseen contagion, it became harder to dismiss. Lab Theta's staff, once a well-oiled machine of inquiry and exploration, had started to fray at the seams. Dr. Voss reviewed the last set of data. Each time they inspected the samples under the electron microscope, there was a collective pause, a stifled breath before the impossible revelation. The microbes weren't just surviving, they were moving, twisting in patterns that suggested more than mindless cellular activity. They pulsed with purpose. She had to tear her gaze away, but that strange movement haunted the edges of her vision, playing tricks on her mind when she least expected it. And now Sanders wasn't alone. Researcher Patel twitched at his station, fingers tapping erratically on the desk as if counting out a rhythm only he could hear. Others exchanged glances steeped in silent terror, eyes reflecting the sterile glow of their monitors. Suddenly, the overhead lights dimmed, flickered. A soft, almost imperceptible buzz rippled through the air, settling in the cavities of their chests. The intercom crackled to life, broadcasting only a low, rhythmic hiss. Elara froze. The room was no longer just a place of science and sterile order. It felt alive, oppressive, watching. Sanders stood abruptly, his face a mask of something both familiar and alien, and he screamed, a guttural, wordless cry that silenced even the machines. "Get him out of here," Elara ordered, her voice sharp, masking the tremor in her chest. Miles grabbed Sanders by the arm, dragging him toward the medical bay, but not before the junior researcher turned his gaze to her once more. His eyes, dark and wide, spoke volumes she could not understand. Behind that stare was something vast, ancient, and patient. Elara didn't realize she was holding her breath until the hiss of the intercom fell silent. The station settled back into an uneasy quiet, but the damage was already done. The air was thick with something unspoken, a sense that they were no longer just researchers peering into the unknown. They were observed, dissected in ways they could never fathom. Lab Theta had changed. The team exchanged few words that night as the silence grew, more solid and oppressive. Their collective denial gave way to a truth more insidious. Whatever was happening wasn't just a side effect of studying the samples. It had been waiting, biding its time, and now it was inside them, unraveling the thin membrane between who they were and what they could become. The lab's hum, once a symbol of progress, now felt like the echo of something deeper, the faint pulse of an unseen organism that thrived on the edge of perception. And the researchers, trapped in their own minds, were its perfect hosts. The days blurred into one another, marked not by the hum of progress, but by an escalating undercurrent of dread. Dr. Elara Voss sat in the dim glow of her workstation, eyes locked on a screen filled with columns of unintelligible data. Her hands shook as she brought a cup of cold, forgotten coffee to her lips. It tasted like ashes, but she sipped it anyway, hoping it would anchor her to reality. The steady tap-tap of fingers drumming on metal jolted her attention. Across the lab, Patel sat hunched over, eyes wide and unblinking, his fingers moving rhythmically, driven by a compulsion he didn't seem to control. The tapping reverberated through Elara's skull, an invasive echo that melded with the anxious whispers skittering at the edge of her thoughts. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. "Patel, take a break," she called, trying to sound authoritative, trying to sound normal. He didn't respond. His fingers continued their dance, tracing invisible symbols on the tabletop that seemed to shift and squirm when she blinked. She looked away, heartbeat quickening. Everyone on the team had started exhibiting these bizarre behaviors, small at first, then insidious. The mind parasites weren't just foreign bodies invading their brains. They were reshaping who they were, blurring the boundaries between host and invader. Elara glanced at her reflection in the observation window, half expecting to see a stranger staring back. Her eyes looked wrong, too dark, too wide. It was as if someone else were wearing her face, puppeteering her expressions from beneath her skin. She looked away quickly, heart thudding in her chest. A sharp, metallic clang snapped her back into the present. Dr. Miles Ito stumbled through the entrance, eyes unfocused and bloodshot. His lab coat was askew, torn at the shoulder, and he mumbled under his breath, a fragmented stream of words that made Elara's skin prickle. "What happened, Miles?" she asked, rising from her chair. The distance between them seemed to stretch impossibly, the room elongating in a vertiginous trick of the mind. Her pulse quickened as his gaze settled on her, empty and infinite. I saw them, Elara," he whispered, voice hollow. He pressed a shaking hand to his temple. "They're not in us. We're in them." The room fell silent. The only sound was the muted whir of the air filtration system, struggling to maintain the illusion of safety. Elara's stomach churned with the sudden clarity of his words. Memories she hadn't lived flashed behind her eyes. A sunset on an alien world, the scent of metal and ammonia, the sensation of cold tendrils wrapping around a spine. She gasped and stumbled, gripping the edge of her workstation for support. The memories weren't hers. They belonged to the parasites, fragments of experiences too vast, too alien to understand. "Get medical here now," she commanded the empty room, knowing no one would come. The medical bay had been overrun with staff who sat motionless, mumbling or laughing or weeping with no explanation. They were shells of themselves, stolen moments caught in an unending loop of possession. Patel's drumming escalated, sharp raps that synced with the pulsing behind her eyes. Elara slammed a fist on the console. "Patel, stop!" He paused, head swiveling with a mechanical slowness, and stared at her. His eyes glistened with tears that spilled down his cheeks as he spoke in a voice not his own. "Why stop? The rhythm calls, the hive remembers." The words were like a key turning in her mind, unlocking something that should have stayed sealed. Images of sprawling neural networks flashed in her vision, veins of darkness that throbbed like living tissue. It was as if she could see the threads that bound her thoughts to those around her, woven together into an intricate web that pulsed with a shared, malevolent consciousness. The parasites weren't mindless invaders. They were a collective intelligence, and they had a purpose. They had waited beneath the ice for eons, surviving in dormancy, dreaming through millennia. And now, awakened by their inadvertent excavation, they had found hosts that could carry their will beyond the boundaries of Ganymede. Miles collapsed into a chair, head in his hands. His breathing came in ragged gasps. "I can't tell what's me and what's them," he whispered. Elara knew that feeling too well. Her own thoughts were an unstable current, interrupted by flashes of memories that weren't her own. She'd seen herself through the eyes of the parasites, an object, a vessel, something to be consumed and repurposed. The lab shuddered as if sharing their realization. Somewhere, deep within the station, a low hum began, resonant and powerful. It wasn't machinery, it was alive, a heartbeat that echoed in every surface, vibrating in her bones. Elara reached for the emergency override on her console, fingers fumbling, slick with sweat. The lights overhead flickered in a rhythmic pulse, syncing with the humming. The sound intensified until it was more than just noise. It was a command. Patel rose, his movements rigid, unnatural. The others in the room did the same, eyes unfocused and mouths parted as if in prayer. A cold shiver trickled down Elara's spine as she watched them turn, faces illuminated in flashes of electric blue, voices blending into a droning chant. The hum crescendoed into a deafening roar. And in that moment, Elara understood. The parasites didn't need to move or fight. They only needed to be present to infect the most fragile fortress of all, the mind. And once they had that, everything else would follow. The station corridors felt narrower now, as if the walls themselves were conspiring to trap the last remnants of humanity within their steel embrace. Dr. Elara Voss pushed through the suffocating air, her breath shallow and rapid. She glanced behind her, half expecting to see shadows flinch and flicker, but there was only silence broken by the occasional rasp of a distant, disembodied whisper. It had been days, perhaps weeks. Time no longer held meaning here. The signs of infestation had reached their zenith. No longer just the subtle tics or sudden hollow laughs, but full disintegration of identity. They had all become echoes, vessels for an alien consciousness threading through them like a dark river, pooling in the crevices of their minds. The parasites had matured, their hold on the crew tightening into an unbreakable vice. Elara stumbled into the common area, where once there had been laughter, the clatter of meal trays, and the low hum of shared stories. Now it was an abattoir of thought, where individuals sat hunched and motionless, their heads lolling to one side, lips parted in silence or muttering phrases in a language that gnawed at the edge of comprehension. Reyes, one of the engineers, was at the far wall, hands red and raw as he scratched the surface with his nails, engraving symbols that glistened wetly under the harsh fluorescence. The markings warped and writhed as if alive, mirroring the tendrils Elara had seen in her visions. "Reyes," she called out, voice cracked and barely recognizable. He paused mid-scratch, head turning slowly, mechanically, until his eyes met hers. They were not eyes anymore, but dark voids, reflective and hollow, showing no trace of the man who once inhabited them. "We are awake," he said in a voice that seemed to reverberate from everywhere and nowhere. The words were not his, but the echo of the hive mind, the collective whisper of a species older than time. Elara's throat tightened as she backed away, her pulse roaring in her ears. She pressed herself against the wall, feeling the cool metal leech warmth from her body. Reyes turned back to his writing, resuming his frantic work. The sound of scratching clawed at her sanity. Movement flickered at the corner of her vision. Dr. Miles Ito emerged from the shadows, his body slack but his gaze sharp. A tattered bandage wrapped around his arm was stained dark with blood, but he didn't seem to notice. He stepped closer, each footfall a measured, deliberate act. "They're using us, Elara," he said, voice low, almost reverent. "We are their thoughts now. They build through us, remember through us. They need us to be more." "To be what?" she whispered, the words trembling on her tongue like broken glass. He blinked slowly, his face stretching into a twisted, serene smile. "To be them." Sudden, manic laughter erupted from across the room. Patel, who had once been so reserved, now stood on a table, arms outstretched and face contorted in ecstasy. His eyes rolled back as he chanted in the alien language, his voice layered with 100 others. The words wrapped around Elara's mind like tendrils, probing, searching. The rest of the crew stirred, their heads snapping up, eyes glistening and empty. They rose in unison, moving with the fluid grace of marionettes under the control of a single puppeteer. The collective energy in the room thickened, pressing against Elara's chest, suffocating her. Panic surged as the hum returned, vibrating deep in her bones. The parasites were not content to remain dormant any longer. They were taking control. A sudden, sharp pain burst behind her eyes. Images assaulted her vision, rapid-fire flashes that stole her breath. A swarm of ancient, twisting organisms rising from Ganymede's subsurface ocean, pulsing as one, reaching out with thoughts as physical as limbs. They had known waiting, had tasted the slow passage of time until this moment when their will would stretch beyond the icy prison and into a new realm of existence. They were legion, and they were hungry. Elara crumpled to the floor, hands gripping her temples as she tried to shove the invasive thoughts back. But there was no refuge in her own mind. The distinction between self and parasite had become an illusion. She heard Miles's voice again, close to her ear this time, a whisper that both comforted and condemned. "Don't fight it. The more you struggle, the deeper they root." But fighting was all she knew. Summoning the last shreds of her own will, she forced her eyes open and saw the room pulsating with an eerie, luminescent glow. It emanated from the markings on the walls, the eyes of the crew, the spaces between their very atoms. The station was alive with the collective consciousness of the parasites, each crew member a thread woven into a tapestry of shared memory and hunger. "No," she rasped, refusing to let herself dissolve into the sea of thoughts. But even as she spoke, she could feel her resolve slipping, a soft murmur of acceptance rising unbidden within her. A tear rolled down her cheek, burning cold as it fell, and she knew that the station had become a singular entity, an extension of the ancient life that now thrived where only emptiness had been before. The last fragment of herself splintered, and Elara felt the echoes of countless minds wash over her, melding into a vast, unknowable whole. The hum in her bones became the only sound that mattered, and her thoughts drifted into it, disappearing into the endless, unified pulse. Dr. Elara Voss opened her eyes to the sterile gray of the ceiling, each fissure in the metal surface above her magnified as if illuminated by some unseen light. Silence enveloped Ganymede Station, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was a void, a stifled breath held by the cosmos itself, waiting for her to move, to act, to succumb. She was neither alone nor fully herself. The boundaries of her consciousness were porous, invaded by countless fragments of alien memory and desire. Yet deep inside, a sliver of resistance remained, a dying ember that refused to be snuffed out. Her body felt weightless, as though it was no longer bound to her control. The station pulsed around her, a living organism powered by the parasitic intelligence that had consumed it. She pushed herself to sit up, muscles trembling with an unfamiliar will, and stared out across the room. The crew stood in perfect, silent formation, their faces blank slates, eyes dark voids filled with stars that shifted and sparkled with malevolent glee. Miles stood at the forefront, his expression serene and unrecognizable, transformed by the collective will. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze, and she felt a rush of thoughts that weren't her own pierce through her mind. Visions of ancient worlds, shimmering with bioluminescent oceans and spires of organic crystal. She saw them, the first of the parasites, drifting in the great black, searching for consciousness to latch onto, to weave into their boundless tapestry. A voice that was not a voice spoke, vibrating through the station and the marrow of her bones. "You are the bridge," it said. 1,000 whispers melded into one. "Through you we awaken." Elara's chest tightened, the fear clawing up her throat like something alive. She remembered the first days of the infestation, the uncertainty that had become terror, the faces of her colleagues, bright and full of life, now reduced to this hollow legion of reflections. She felt a pang of something almost forgotten. Sorrow. "No," she said, the word slipping past cracked lips. It was barely audible, but it reverberated in her mind like the toll of a great bell. She stood, swaying as the collective's awareness shifted toward her, probing, questioning. The room seemed to warp, every surface stretching and bending with the weight of their gaze. The hum that had haunted them for days built in intensity, the vibration so deep she thought her very atoms might come apart. But then, a moment of clarity. She reached for the console behind her, fingers brushing the cold metal. The panel blinked to life, lines of code reflecting on her damp, pale face. A manual override, an emergency failsafe designed only for the most catastrophic of breaches, whispered at the edge of her consciousness. The parasites flooded her mind, their intentions a suffocating wave. Memories of millennia coursed through her, galaxies born and snuffed out, civilizations rising and folding into the black. They were endless, a species that could not die, only slumber and awaken to consume once more. "Join us," the voice urged, insidious and intoxicating. "Become eternal." Her hand hesitated, hovering over the panel. The temptation to let go, to surrender her identity and dissolve into that vast, timeless consciousness was almost too much to bear. She could feel it, the peace of oblivion, the allure of merging into something greater than herself. The hum turned into a chorus, deep and harmonious, singing the song of a million voices bound by a singular purpose. But then she remembered Sanders' laughter, Patel's vacant chanting, the tears that streaked down Reyes's face as he carved symbols into the walls. These were moments that had meaning because they were human, chaotic, and finite. To lose that was to become nothing. With a cry that came from the deepest part of her, Elara slammed her palm onto the override. Alarms shrieked through the station, cutting through the collective's song, breaking its hold. The lights pulsed blood red, warning of impending destruction. The crew blinked, some gasping as if surfacing from a deep dive, others collapsing to the floor as though strings had been cut. But the hum roared louder, a wounded animal snarling as its control fractured. Elara's vision blurred, pain lancing through her skull as the alien will fought back. "You won't take us," she whispered, teeth clenched. The countdown began, an artificial voice droning out the seconds to self-destruction. Each number felt like a heartbeat, her heartbeat, echoed by the thundering pulse of the parasite hive. Miles stepped forward, a smile both tender and broken on his face. His eyes were no longer voids, but glistened with tears that tracked lines down his gaunt cheeks. "Elara, it was never meant to be like this." His voice was both his own and theirs, a fusion of past and present. "You can still come with us, still become more." She shook her head, tears mixing with the sweat on her face. "I can't." The final seconds stretched into an eternity as the station began to shudder, metal groaning under the pressure of forces unleashed. She met Miles's gaze one last time before the lights flared, blinding white, and the world dissolved into fire and silence. Back on Earth, the beacon from Ganymede station sputtered to life one final time, sending out a short, corrupted signal. The words were broken, distorted by static, but one phrase repeated over and over, too human and raw to be ignored. "We were never alone." Then there was nothing but the vast, silent stretch of space where the station had been, the stars burning cold and indifferent, witnesses to a battle fought not with weapons, but with will. In the quiet that followed, far beneath the ice of Ganymede, something ancient sighed and settled, waiting for the next awakening.